The cold came early that year, and it came mean. Delia felt it in her knuckles before she felt it in the air, that deep, grinding ache that her mother used to call bone weather. She stood outside the feed store in Harrow Creek, Montana, holding her daughter against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you're terrified of dropping. Nell was 14 months old and had stopped crying an hour ago, which scared Delia more than the crying had. The notice had gone up 3 days after Curtis died. She hadn't understood it at first. The language was formal, the handwriting cramped and official-looking. But the store owner's wife had read it to her twice, slowly, with a kind of pity that felt worse than anything written on the paper. The debt was real, the claim on the property was real, and the auction was set for the first Friday in November, which was today. Delia had not eaten since yesterday morning. She told herself it was because Nell needed the last of the hardtack more than she did. That was true, but there was another truth underneath it, one she kept pushing down. She simply could not make herself care enough to eat. Curtis had been gone. 6 weeks. 6 weeks was not long enough to stop reaching for him in the dark. It was not long enough to stop thinking she heard his boots on the porch steps, but it was apparently long enough for the bank in Billings to send a man with documents and a hard mouth, and no interest whatsoever in the particulars of how a woman becomes a widow at 26. The auctioneer set up on the steps of the feed store just after 9 in the morning. He had the red, cheerful face of a man who enjoyed his work, and he announced the terms of the sale with the same tone he might use to describe a good horse. Brisk, efficient, forward-moving. Delia stood at the edge of the small crowd and listened to him list what had been hers: the mule, the 2 milk cows, the iron stove Curtis had hauled up from Butte on a borrowed wagon the spring they married. She kept her eyes on Nell's face. The bids came quickly at first. Men she recognized from town, men who had shaken Curtis's hand and eaten at her table. They did not look at her directly. That was a kind of mercy, she supposed. Then the auctioneer reached the last item on his list, and the crowd shifted, and Delia understood what was happening a full 10 seconds before she could make herself believe it. It was not legal, exactly. She knew that dimly, the way you know things you've never had cause to think about. But it was not entirely illegal either, not out here, not in the way things actually worked, rather than the way they were written down. A widow with a debt and a nursing child, and no male kin within 300 miles was, in practical terms, a problem the town needed solving, and the auctioneer, with his red, cheerful face, had a solution. "She's able-bodied," he announced, without looking at her. "Good worker, by all accounts. Child's healthy. Any man willing to assume the remaining debt gets first claim on their labor and housing through the winter. Legal paperwork filed with the county, all above board." The crowd was quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back said a number. Delia did not move. She held Nell tighter and looked at a fixed point on the wall of the feed store. A rusted nail, nothing special. And she made herself breathe slowly and evenly, because Nell would feel it if she stopped. 2 more men offered bids. She recognized one of them. He ran the saloon on the north end of town, and had a reputation that traveled ahead of him into every room he entered. She stared at the nail. She was thinking about the river, not in the way that frightened her, just the fact of it, the cold grey fact, that the Clark Fork ran half a mile behind the feed store, and that the water would be very cold by now. She was not going to do anything about that. She knew she wasn't, but she understood, for the first time, why the thought existed. It was the mind offering an exit when every door in the room was closing. The saloon man raised his bid again, and then a shadow fell across the top of the steps. Delia didn't see him arrive. One moment the bid was hanging in the cold air, and the next there was a man on horseback at the edge of the crowd, and the crowd was parting around him the way water parts around something large and immovable. He didn't push through. They just moved. He was big, not the exaggerated bigness of a man who works at being imposing, but the kind that comes from years of actual labor in actual wilderness, the kind that means something. He wore a canvas coat that had been repaired so many times. The patches had patches. His hat was dark, with old sweat and weather. He had not shaved in what appeared to be several weeks, possibly longer. He looked like something the mountain had produced on its own, without any input from civilization. He looked at the auctioneer. "What's the total debt?" he said. It was not a question, exactly. It had the flat, declarative weight of a man who was used to getting answers. The auctioneer gave him a number. The man reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and produced a leather pouch that made a sound when he set it on the railing, a soft, heavy, final sound. "That covers it," he said, "and then some. You keep the difference." The auctioneer stared at the pouch. He looked up at the man. He looked back at the pouch. "You understand what you're—" "I understand," the man said. He turned his horse and looked at Delia for the first time. His eyes were the particular grey-green of river ice, just before it breaks, the color of something that had been cold for a very long time. He looked at Nell. Then he looked back at Delia. "You got anything that needs fetching?" he asked. She had one bag. She'd had it packed since Tuesday, because there had been nowhere to go and she'd packed it. Anyway, the way you do things when you need to feel like you're doing something. She held up Nell with one arm and picked up the bag with the other. He didn't offer to help with either one. She followed him out of Harrow Creek without speaking. His name was Greer. She found this out not from him, but from a woman who called out from a doorway as they passed the last building on the east road. "Greer, you've lost your mind," the woman said, not unkindly, and he lifted one hand from the reins without turning around and kept riding. Delia filed the name away and kept walking. Her feet were already numb. She hadn't mentioned this. She wasn't going to. The cabin was 40 minutes northeast of town, by horse, which meant it was longer on foot, and the trail climbed almost from the start. The trees closed in around them, and the light changed, flattened, turned white, filtered through spruce and lodgepole pine until the sky was just a pale suggestion above the canopy. Nell slept against Delia's chest, heavy and warm, the only warm thing in the world. Greer did not look back at her. She did not ask him to slow down. When they reached the cabin, she understood why the woman in town had said what she'd said. It was not a disaster, exactly. The roof was sound, the walls were tight, there was no visible rot on the door frame, but it was, without question, the dwelling of a man who had decided long ago that comfort was someone else's concern. There was a table, there were 2 chairs, mismatched. There was a stove that was clearly the most tended-to object in the building, black and solid, and radiating a heat so intense it hit her like a physical force when he opened the door. There was one room. Delia stood in the doorway with Nell and looked at the space and did the arithmetic. Greer unsaddled the horse without looking at her. "You can have the cot," he said. "I'll take the floor. I don't need. I sleep on the floor fine," he said. "Did it before you got here." This was not an argument she could win on any ground she could identify, so she let it go. She put Nell down on the cot. It was narrow, barely wide enough for the 2 of them, and she took stock of what was in the cabin. A small store of dried beans, jerky, cornmeal, a row of traps hung on the wall, a rifle above the door, and a handgun on the table that he picked up and put somewhere else before she'd fully registered it. A Bible with a broken spine on a shelf, so high she'd need a chair to reach it, and on the floor beside the stove, a small wooden crate with a blanket in it that she couldn't identify the purpose of until she heard the sound from outside, a low conversational bleating, and realized there was a goat. "Is that?" she started. "Nanny goat," he said. "She's dry right now. Was thinking of getting rid of her." He said it in a tone that did not invite further comment. She found out, without asking, that he'd changed his mind about the goat. 3 days later, when Nell woke in the night, screaming the high, thin scream of a hungry baby, and Delia had nothing to give her, nothing at all, and sat on the edge of the cot with her daughter in her arms, and her eyes shut, and her jaw so tight it ached. She heard him get up from the floor. She heard him put on his coat. She heard the door open and close. He came back 40 minutes later. He put a tin cup on the edge of the cot without a word. It was warm. She stared at it. "Goat milk," he said, already lying back down. She came in, figured she would. Delia looked at the cup. She looked at Nell. She looked at the dark shape of him on the floor, already apparently asleep, or doing a very good impression of it. "Thank you," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a word. November deepened, and the cold became a presence in the cabin, a fifth resident they arranged their days around. Greer left before first light most mornings and came back before dark, and he rarely explained where he'd been or what he'd done. She could usually tell from what he brought back. Pelts, when he'd been trapping. Sometimes a rabbit or a grouse, once a young deer that he dressed outside, and hung under the eave without comment as though venison in November was simply what happened. He did not talk much. She had not expected him to, what she had not expected. What she found herself noticing, against her better judgment. The way you notice water coming in under a door before you're ready to deal with it, was how consistently he arranged things, without making a production of it. The woodpile was always full by evening. The goat's water was always fresh. When Nell got a cough that lasted 4 days, and Delia sat up the first 2 nights with her heart in her throat, she came out on the 3rd morning to find a small pot of something on the stove, dried elderberry, and wild ginger simmered in water, she thought, or something like it. He was outside. She did not ask about the pot. She gave Nell some from a spoon. The cough broke that afternoon. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't either. What she did say, one evening when the snow was coming down hard enough that neither of them was going anywhere, was, "You don't have to stay on the floor." He looked up from the trap he was mending. His expression did not change, but she'd been watching his face long enough now to read the things that didn't change in it. "There's room," she said, "on the cot. If you put Nell between us, I'm not suggesting anything, it's cold." He went back to the trap. She thought she'd miscalculated badly, and she pulled her knees up and stared at the stove. Then he said, "Not yet." 2 words, but the yet was doing a tremendous amount of work. And she sat with it in the warmth of the cabin while the snow fell outside. And she did not examine it too closely, because she was not ready to, but she did not throw it away either. The trouble came in the 3rd week of November. She heard the horses first, not the easy sound of someone passing through, but the careful, spaced-out sound of people trying not to be heard. She was alone in the cabin with Nell. Greer had been gone since morning. There were 3 of them. She could see them through the gap in the shutter, 2 on horses, 1 standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. The one standing was the man from the saloon. She recognized the line of his shoulders before she recognized his face. She picked up Nell and put her in the crate by the stove, with the blanket around her, because it was the most enclosed space in the room, and instinct said enclosed. Then she stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the spot above the door, where the rifle was not, because Greer had taken it that morning. The handgun was on the table. She had fired a gun exactly once in her life, at the age of 11, at a tin can her uncle had set up on a fence post. She had not hit it. She picked up the handgun. The door opened without a knock. The saloon man filled the frame. He looked at her, then at the gun, and his expression went through several calculations very quickly. "Now," he said, in a voice he probably thought was reasonable. "No need for. You need to leave," Delia said. Her voice surprised her. It was level. She would not have predicted that. "The debt's been paid," the man said. "I understand that, but the thing is, the man who paid it, folks aren't real certain he had clean money. Banks looking into it. Could be the sale gets reversed." He smiled. It didn't change the temperature of his eyes at all. "I just want to talk." I said leave. He took a step inside. She raised the gun. He stopped. He looked at her, the way men look at women who are doing things they haven't given permission for, a look compounded of irritation and disbelief in roughly equal parts. And then there was a sound from behind him, a very specific sound, the sound of a rifle being cocked. "I'd step back out," Greer said. He was behind them, had come through the trees on the south side, she realized, which meant he'd seen the horses and circled before they knew he was there. He looked the same as he always looked, except for something around his eyes that she had not seen before. It was not rage exactly. It was colder than rage. It was the look of a man performing a calculation and finding the numbers unsatisfactory. The saloon man stepped back outside. There was a conversation she could not fully hear, low voices, Greer's among them, a tone that brooked absolutely nothing, and then horses moving away through the snow, and then silence. Greer came inside. He put the rifle back above the door. He looked at her still holding the handgun, and he looked at Nell in the crate, and something shifted in the set of his shoulders. "Nell okay," he said. "She's fine," Delia said. "She slept through it." He nodded. He sat down in one of the mismatched chairs and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. She realized with something that moved through her like cold water that he'd been afraid, not for himself. She put the handgun down on the table. "Greer," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. She said it differently than the first time, by the cot with the goat's milk. That time it had been reflex, courtesy, the automatic words of a person who was raised to say them. This time it was the whole sentence. All of it, everything she could not untangle from those two words. He held her gaze for a long moment, then he looked away, which she was starting to understand, was not distance but the opposite of it. The thing he did when something landed and he needed to give it somewhere to go. "You held the gun right," he said finally. "Two hands. Most people drop their elbow." She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together instead. "I didn't hit anything," she said. "Didn't need to." December came. The saloon man did not come back. The county sent no paperwork, whether Greer had done something about this, or whether it had simply resolved itself. She never found out, and she stopped looking for the answer, sometime around the middle of the month. What she found instead was something she didn't have a name for yet, or wasn't using the name for. The way you sometimes know a word, and choose not to say it because saying it makes it a thing that can be taken away. She started cooking in the evenings, not because she'd been asked to. He hadn't asked her to do anything, had not once made a demand on her time, or her presence, or any part of her, but because it was one thing she could do that made the cabin feel different. She made cornbread from the meal in the sack and fried salt pork when there was any, and once, with the last of the dried beans, and some wild onions she'd found along the creek bed on a warmer afternoon, a soup that made the whole cabin smell like somewhere a person could belong. He ate everything she put in front of him without comment. She learned to read his appreciation. In other ways, the way he took a second piece without her offering. The slight pause before he picked up the spoon, like a man remembering to be present for something. Nell discovered him in December, which was how Delia thought of it. A discovery, the way you discover a room in a house you thought you knew. One morning Nell pulled herself up on the leg of his chair and stood there, looking at him with the absolute uncomplicated attention of a child who has no preconceptions. And he looked back at her with an expression that Delia would remember for the rest of her life. He was not soft with it. He was not cooing or performing anything. He just looked at her as though he was taking her seriously, which was, it turned out, exactly the right thing. He held out one finger. Nell grabbed it with both hands. He sat there for a while with Nell holding his finger, and Delia pretending to be very interested in the piece of mending in her lap, and the fire made its sounds, and the snow came down outside, and nobody said anything. He started coming in earlier, she noticed. She didn't say so. He was late one evening, in the 3rd week of December, late enough that the soup had gone past ready, and into something more modest, and she was sitting by the stove with Nell asleep in the crate and telling herself it was nothing. trapping line, weather, the ordinary reasons a man is late when she heard his step on the porch. And then, nothing. He didn't come in. She went to the door. He was sitting on the step, just sitting, in the full dark and the cold, his forearms on his knees. She could not see his face. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the warmth of the cabin at her back. "Greer, go back in," he said. "You'll freeze. Come inside." A pause. "In a minute." She went back in and left the door open, which was impractical, and let the cold in, and she did it anyway. In a few minutes she heard him stand. He came inside, and she shut the door behind him, and she did not ask what he'd been sitting there thinking about, because she was increasingly certain she knew, and equally certain he would get there in his own time. He sat down. She put soup in front of him. He ate half of it and stopped. He was looking at the table. "I paid that debt," he said, "because I was there, because no one else was going to. I want you to know that's why I did it." Delia was quiet. I didn't do it for any." He stopped, tried again. "You don't owe me anything. I want to say that clearly." She looked at him across the table, at the patches on his coat and the weathered lines of his face and the particular way he held himself when he was saying something that cost him something. "I know that," she said. He nodded, looking at the soup. "But," she said. He looked up. She let it sit there between them for a moment, just the word. The door, the word opened. She was 26 years old, and she had been terrified and frozen and empty for 6 weeks, and then she had been a great many other things, and she knew, sitting across from this man in this cabin in the snow, that but was the most important word she had said in a long time. "But I'm still here," she said, "in case that means something." He looked at her for a long time. The fire settled. Nell made a small sound in the crate and went quiet again. "Yeah," he said finally. "It does." He picked up the spoon and finished the soup. She sat across from him and said nothing else. And outside the snow fell on the mountain, and the goat made her small complaints from the shelter of the porch. And inside the cabin the stove kept its steady warmth, and that was enough. It was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely enough. In the morning, he brought in extra wood without being asked, more than they needed, enough to last 3 days. He stacked it neatly by the stove and did not explain why he'd brought so much. She didn't ask. Nell stood at the edge of the crate and held out her arms to him. He picked her up. He was not graceful about it. He held her at a slight distance, first, as if recalibrating, and then drew her in, and she grabbed a fistful of his coat and pulled, the way babies do, insisting on proximity, and he let her, standing in the middle of the small cabin, with a baby in his arms and a look on his face, like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to have this. "Heavy," he said. "She's been eating well," Delia said. He looked at her over the top of Nell's head. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not yet, but the architecture of one, the thing that comes before. "Good," he said. And that word, in his mouth, in that cabin, on that morning, meant everything it was possible for a word to mean.